Good evening. My name is Sofia Lemos. I'm the Associate Curator of Public Programs at the Riga International Biennial of Contemporary Art, and suddenly it all blossoms. It is my pleasure welcoming you this evening to the sixth convergence of our online series of talks and conversations, this week devoted to the word magic. Common sense has us believe that only certain things exist, molecules but not mythical creatures, fiber optic connectivity but not ether, and also contradictory things, for instance, border control and quantum non-locality. This is what we understand as reality. Yet our speaker this evening argues that reality varies with each new era of the world, with each civilization, in turn shaping the field of what is possible to do, think, and imagine. If we can change the common ground that sustains our common sense, the latter adapts with it. These are not utopias or far-flung historical realities, but practices of world-making. The London-based Sicilian philosopher and writer Federico Campagna calls this transformative political force magic, and believes that another reality principle can be assembled if its building blocks are not based on linguistic categories, but instead on what he defines as the ineffable. In his words, we must imagine a new set of reality principles that would allow for a new range of the possible to emerge. His work revolves around the possibility of a political architecture of emancipation, having written extensively on ethics, political philosophy, namely anarchism. Federico studied economics in Milan and cultural studies in London. In 2009, he founded the Multilingual Journal for Critical Theory through Europe, and he started a long-term collaboration with the Italian autonomia philosopher Franco Berardi-Bifo, whose philosophical anthology, 40 Years Against Work, Federico edited. This evening, he will probe our Western understanding of time as linear, unidirectional, one-dimensional, and made up of spatial successions, by looking at the current radical shifts in reality taking place as we speak, from the toppling of statues and public monuments related to colonial past-presents, to apocalyptic narratives of environmental catastrophe. And of course, what it means for the artistic and poetic imaginaries to operate in the liminal spaces before and after the end of a world. Federico is the author of Prophetic Culture, Recreation for Post-Future Adolescents, which is forthcoming with Bloomsbury, the global trans-historical journey and much recommended reading, Technic and Magic, The Reconstruction of Reality, and The Last Night, Anti-Work Atheism Adventure. Federico is a visiting lecturer and tutor at KABK in The Hague and is the director of the rights department at the radical publisher Verso Books. Federico, we're grateful for your time and for connecting with us today.
Thank you, Sofia. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you guys for watching. As Sofia was saying, I specialize and discuss, in particular, metaphysics and ideas about reality. But before getting there, I would like to start with what's happening at the moment. As we speak, as Sofia was saying, there is a very interesting situation unfolding and a very interesting debate about taking down statues of slave traders and colonial oppressors from early modernity. This is a very interesting situation, and it's long overdue, of course. Here in the UK, finally, we're getting rid of some. But it also opens some very interesting questions. We have to confront symbols of oppression, obviously, but we cannot dismantle all symbols of oppressions from all ages of history and from all over the world, simply for the reason that we would lose the near totality of ancient culture from all over the world. So we need to create, and at least we need to imagine, a sort of methodology to be able to address the problem of which statues we can confront, and not just statues. Statues, novels, films, cultural artifacts, the testimony of a regime of oppression. Which ones we should take down, or deface, or recontextualize, depending on how we want to do it, and which ones we should leave as historical testimonies. It is, of course, a very difficult and complex problem, and we could face it in many different ways. I think that one possible way of facing it would be to imagine that certain elements of culture and of artistic production no longer belong to the age in which we live. They date to a time that is in stark historical discontinuity with the present. Since it is discontinuous with the present, we can look at them as historical artifacts that testify and testimony of a certain age of the world. Conversely, there are other artifacts. I think about Confederate statues in the US, or the famous statue of the, well, now famous, it's just recently become famous once it was sunk in water in Bristol, of the slave trader Colston. Items like that belong to the same exact historical era as the present. This would allow us, for example, to imagine that a culture acting on its own cultural artifacts is a culture surviving, being alive and moving forward, while conversely a culture destroying historical artifacts from past ages, from other worlds, is just a culture that engages in senseless vandalism. This sounds fairly simple, but it's also very complicated. Because how do we define the discontinuity between different eras of the world? One way, of course, it would be to do it in a materialist sense. So, for example, looking at the different conditions of the socio-economic system, of the distribution of resources, of the way in which cultural hegemony plays out in a certain time. This is one possibility, but in this particular way, there are some difficulties to create some actual discontinuities in time. Certain regimes continue much longer than the society in which they are embedded. The UK, where I live, is a case in point. We still have aristocracy that dates back to the time of the Normans, 1,000 years ago. But the world of 1,000 years ago and the world of today are historically discontinuous. So we need to refine a little bit how we can cut different sections in time and in history. For this task, complex as it is, I believe that metaphysics might offer some interesting and useful tools. Why? Before tackling the question, we need to step back a little bit and observe some very obvious elements of our life in the world every moment in the day. When we look around ourselves in a room, in this particular room, and we look at things, we see around ourselves a world. We see a world made of distinct items that exist in particular ways, and the world which we see around ourselves is populated by particular things. For example, in this room, there are books, pens, plants. There are no ghosts or spirits or gods. It is by ordering the perceptions that I have of this room in a specific way, for example, that makes appear books but doesn't make appear ghosts and spirits, that I create around myself a landscape in which I can live, and this is necessary. Without this activity of ordering, this creation of the cosmos, the order, the beautiful order, it would be impossible to have a world in which I can live. But at the same time, it is not an uncontroversial exercise, because I could order my perceptions of this room in a different way. For example, I could allow for the existence of ghosts or of gods or of the souls of dead people, and so on and so forth, or of energies, you name it. In different moments in history, we have made worlds, we have worlded as a verb, differently. Different moments in history have witnessed physically different worlds appearing. As in, people in different moments in history have made worlds according to different parameters. Each of them, metaphysically speaking, is equally legitimate. Is equally legitimate in the sense that when we decide how to order reality around ourselves, how to make a world out of an avalanche of raw perceptions, we cannot base our decision on anything prior to that. We cannot base it on prior logic or on prior ethics, because ethics and logic derive from the particular way in which we understand the stuff of the world. So they are axiomatic decisions. Axiomatic is a bit like at the beginning of Euclid's Elements of Geometry, when the great scientist of Greek antiquity, before starting a discussion of geometry, an exact science, defines a series of axioms, a series of points that cannot be demonstrated anywhere else, that cannot be demonstrated inside the book, that he sets poetically, aesthetically. So each of them is legitimate in that sense, equally legitimate, as in equally arbitrary. But they're not all equal in their consequences. according to the particular way in which we make world around ourselves, we end up with different worlds. And this means we end up with a different population around us, a different range of things with which we deal, a different range of relationships with which we deal, and thus we face a different field of the possible, of what is possible, what it makes sense to think, to do, and to imagine. On the basis of that, we have a certain range of options of what we can do, what we cannot do, what is superstition, and what is reasonable. When we think about discontinuity then in history, aside from the socioeconomic aspects, which are of course very important, and aside even from the cultural aspects that are also very important, we should consider something that might come even before them, the metaphysical settings of particular times in the world. We have observed throughout history different eras engaging with the activity of worlding differently, and we can detect in the great transformations of history not just shifts in the relationships of power and the distribution of resources or of the means of production, but also different ways of making world according to different settings. Let's be a little bit clearer though about this. And this touches also a series of debates that we are having at the moment, not just related to the toppling of statues of slave traders, but more broadly, culturally. I said that making world is an activity. So this implies, obviously, that there is no such thing as the world being already there. But this activity, what kind of activity is it? I said it's axiomatic, it's aesthetic. Okay, but let's be a bit more specific. We make world usually by separating, by ordering, by putting things in their place and creating a connection between the things that we have decided to cut out of the world as separate. This particular way of ordering is a typical way of ordering through language. The connections are the syntax, the positions are the grammar, and the items are the elements of language, if you wish. I am describing it like this, using language in particular as the metaphor, because this allows us to understand the process not just as a cosmogonic process, that creates a cosmos, that creates a universe and creates an order, creates a world, but also as a narrative process, a narration of the world. And this is, I think, important to keep in mind. Because if we consider the way of making world as a narration, then we have to stick with the metaphor. Every writer knows that if you use a metaphor, you have to stick with it to the bitter end, and you have to be very careful which metaphors you use for that reason. When you think about narration, the first thing that comes to mind is that a narration depends on the voice of the person narrating, or of the collective narrating. Anyway, of the voice narrating it. And a voice has a beginning and has an end. When we think, for example, about the movement of time within this context, we're not thinking about something. Movement of time, very simply, in the sense not only of before and after, but also in terms of past, present, and future. We don't think about it in absolute autonomous terms, as if time was a thing that exists in itself, undisturbed by our silly activity of worlding. We know it through philosophy. We've known it through philosophy since time immemorial. We know it through science more recently, that time in itself doesn't exist. It doesn't exist as an autonomous entity, but if we consider the activity of worlding as a narration, we realize that time is part of this narration. But what part is it? A narration has a musical element to it, has a certain pace, has a certain rhythm. Time can be understood in that sense as the rhythm of the particular narration of a certain world. And this implies a number of things. For example, that when we think about time or different times according to different worlds, we no longer think about timelines. Why? Once again, because metaphors are tricky beasts. A line, geometrically speaking, is an infinite series of points. Infinite, no beginning and no end. But this is not how time emerges within a certain world. When a certain narration of the world begins, then a certain time segment begins, a certain rhythm that ends with the end of that narration. Within that segment, you have past, present, and future that are not just relative, but also absolute within the segment, within the narration. When we make world in a certain way, we give rise to a new segment of time with its own past, present, and future. And the future is no longer just what comes next infinitely, or the past stretches back infinitely, but the past stretches back to the beginning of the narration, discontinuity, and then stretches forward to the end of the narration, discontinuity again. This brings some very interesting paradoxes. We started looking at how to deal with the past, but I think that especially for cultural producers, everybody is a cultural producer to a certain extent, willingly or unwillingly, wittingly or unwittingly. But there are people that specialize, let's so to say, in cultural production, writers, architects, musicians, and so on and so forth. For people that specialize in cultural production, there is an interesting paradox here. If past, present, and future belong to a certain segment, it means that at the end of this segment, the future ends. That future ends. The future then becomes no longer a horizon that moves as you walk, but it becomes what Ernest Junger calls the wall of time, literally a wall against which you crush. This is problematic for cultural producers, because when you produce cultural artifacts, you no longer do it for your contemporaries, people that share your exact same present. You do it for your contemporary in the sense of people that share your same time segment, people that make world like you, people that can understand the things that you're talking about like you, that get the innuendos, get the unwritten bits. But then you also do it for the future. You do it for the future of your own timeline, of your own time segment, sorry. But what happens if that future is about to end? Very simply, not apocalyptically, but very simply, what happens if the particular narration of the world in which you happen to live, in which the world is made of certain things, language is structured in a certain way, reality is composed physically of certain objects that we recognize, what happens if that narration is approaching the end of its curve, like an arch, no? What happens if you're towards the end? Well, it happens that the future is no longer there. It's no longer there for you to address it, and it's no longer there to receive whatever you do. This sounds quite daunting as a prospect, but we shouldn't be too worried about it. This is a very normal occurrence in history. Every age has ended. Nothing terrible happens. Sometimes it does, but not always. And it is a normal challenge that cultural producers always have to face. I believe that in this particular moment in time, a certain civilization, and to understand what I mean by civilization, let's imagine once again that we're talking about making world according to aesthetic rules, axiomatic rules. I make world however I like. And depending on that, I create a time segment that depends on the narration of the world. How can we, you and I, interact and understand each other? We need to synchronize, basically. Civilizations can be understood as metronomes for worlding. Okay? Particular metronomes that synchronize particular ways of making world. That's many civilizations because there's many possible ways of making world. So civilization to a certain extent provide that particular function. And I believe that the particular civilization at the moment in the present, the one in which I find myself to live, I live in London and I live in the heart, so to say, of this civilization that we could call Westernized modernity. Modernity is fairly clear to understand in what sense, and also locates it in time, the beginning, around the 17th century. Westernized means not only European, but the West and Europe are different concepts. The West is much more transatlantic, so to say, as a center of gravity. This particular way of worlding, which is connected very strongly with a particular social order, and in turn is connected very strongly with a particular arrangement of the economic system, the creation of certain infrastructures which are across the globe, a certain transmission of resources, people and goods, and so on and so forth. Now, that particular way of worlding, the way of Westernized modernity, seems to be about to end. Not so much because it has implicit contradictions in the way in which it makes world. Every way of worlding has implicit contradictions. But mostly because it is so connected so strongly with a certain social order that as this social order disintegrates, that particular form of worlding disintegrates simultaneously. This is quite unique of this specific civilization, which is so connected with the technological mega machine, for example, that if the mega machine was ever to falter because of nuclear war, for example, maybe a nuclear war caused by the effects of climate change or any severe interruptions to the network, then the society disintegrates and the particular voice that sings that story of the world equally disintegrates. So, for example, I myself and many people like me, we are finding ourselves in this situation of being towards the end of the historical curve of a certain future, of a certain time segment. So what do we do now? If nobody is there to ever take what we're going to say, because there is no future left. We're no longer in the situation of the 19th century in which we could engage with utopias, with projects, with keeping the future open for our children or for the people that will come, because the future is no longer there. So how do we engage with people that come after the end of this future, as in people that will continue to live, will continue to make world, probably in the very same territories in which we find ourselves now, but according to parameters of reality that are entirely different from ours, which also implies in a time segment that is different from ours, with different way of counting time, different way of arranging things, different way of speaking. And thus people to whom our journalism, for example, will be, first of all, of zero interest, but secondly, also incomprehensible. Our memes, our jokes, our in-jokes are incomprehensible. Not counting, of course, the fact that since our cultural production is so connected with the digital medium, they will not even receive it. Digital medium is the most fragile of all ever invented, more fragile than the papyri that we lost from antiquity. I think, to a certain extent, it is the challenge that we have to face today, and we have to face it, I believe, with also first of all, without anguish. It is absolutely identical to exist, to live at the beginning of a certain narration of the world, at the triumphal middle, or at the end. It's the same. Writing a book, writing the last page or the first is the same. Playing a piece of piano at the beginning or at the end is the same. There's no tragedy particular involved in being at the end of this particular world. Secondly, to be honest, I don't think we should mourn it too much. This particular form of worlding had its own advantages, incredible technological breakthroughs, for example, and its very severe disadvantages. Just to mention a few: the invention of total war, the atomic bomb, the concentration camp, the police force, which not many people know, it's quite a recent invention, the prison system as a prison industrial system, the devastation of the ecological environment, and so on and so forth, okay? No, I'm not saying this was the worst age ever invented. I'm just saying that, it's an age that has some advantages and disadvantages. We shouldn't be too attached to it. But we have to face the problem. And we have to face it also because we have the responsibility of facing it. So let's move and shift the focus from ourselves as we are now, towards the end of this world, and look at the people after the end of this world or after the end of a world. Because you see, when the world ends, the universe doesn't stop, and humanity also, or other species of life, don't end. People continue to make worlds. Usually when a certain metronome, a certain civilization disintegrates, the period immediately after is a strange period of weak worlding. As in, the world continues to emerge, of course, people still make it, but in the lack of but missing a metronome. So there is a certain fragility. The world is as if permeable to elements that come through from unbridled raw reality, more fiercely, more violently, and that makes it a bit problematic sometimes in the time immediately after the end of a world. We cannot predict, of course, who these people will be. They will come just after us, and we cannot predict exactly what they will be looking for, what the challenges they will be facing, and so on. Some of them we might predict, but not all. But we can have some ideas of what kind of people there will be, more or less, to be more precise. We can have some idea of this type of subjectivity, the particular way of being in the world, okay, of seeing themselves and being in the world that they will entertain. How can we have these ideas? Because this has happened before. As Sofia was saying, I come from Sicily, just walk through the streets of Palermo and you see it you see it in the landscape, different futures, one on top of the other in the same building, for example. And what do we know, looking at history, about people at the beginning of a new world? First of all, we know that in history they're called archaics. This is quite fascinating. Archaic people are not primitive people. In historiography, you define as primitive somebody at the very beginning of time. It is a fiction, of course. Nobody's ever been primitive in the sense in which historiography understands it. More 19th century historiography, to be honest. An archaic is somebody that comes after the end of a previous world. Like archaic Greece, for example, after the end of the Mycenaean civilization. And archaic people tend to have similar characteristics to another type of people that we know very well. We know very well because we have been them. Adolescents. If you look at the way in which you transition through the course of your life, you yourself, me, we have passed through different ways of worlding. The way in which a child makes world is not equal, is not continuous with the way in which an adult makes world. Metaphysically, the world changes at the end of childhood because the stuffed toy no longer speaks. Because things no longer are alive in the same way that they were before. The substance of the world transforms. The future of childhood ends. That's why some plans that you have as a child no longer come into fruition, not because you betrayed your past self, but because that time segment has ended. Adolescence typically is the moment that comes, especially early adolescence, that comes just after the end of a world. And is characterized by a fragility of worlding and also by a certain distrust. The specific awkwardness of adolescence, which is the awkwardness of the archaic age, of any archaic age, is characterized by a certain distrust of the promises of order and of the lure of disorder. Disorder, of course, is a problem for an adolescent, in the sense of for an archaic person, or for anybody who has to make world. The world is very fragile, the structure, the way of making sense is quite fragile, and you need to tackle that problem by creating something, by creating a landscape. But order is also a problem. The moment you create an order, first of all, you have lost the entirety of all the other possibilities that you could have enacted, and secondly, you will have to obey that order. And that order might crush you and might destroy you. The story of Oedipus is quite interesting in this sense. He faces the Sphinx, absolute chaos, the primordial force, which addresses him with an enigma. As soon as he bridles or disorder, establishes a new law in the city of Thebes, and that new system, new order, destroys him immediately. Okay, so this is the typical kind of passage. So we know a little bit the kind of subjectivity of the people that come after the end of a certain civilization, of a certain future. If we wish to address them, this is most of what we can tell about them. We cannot tell what specific language they will speak. We can only tell that they will not speak our same language. So if we speak with them, we need to use something that is not specific to our time. But also we know that they have this particular concern, restarting to make world, but being careful, or trying, not to be crushed by their own creation. So if we think about the way in which we address them, I think we should consider that the legacy of our culture that we leave behind has somehow to be part of that new narration in a very particular way. And here I think it's important to also kind of put a little disclaimer. It is obvious, but it's one of those obvious things that we tend to forget sometimes. When we think about the environment, we understand very well the fact that our responsibility to leave behind a legacy that is environmentally sustainable. What does it mean? Not that we freeze the environment in an absolutely perfect congealed form, but that we don't devastate it, or at least don't devastate it to the extent to which we make it impossible for the environment to keep transforming itself the way it usually does. The same applies to culture. when we leave a certain cultural legacy behind, we have to confront also the idea, as with the environment, that we have to leave something behind that will become part of a new form of worlding. To a certain extent, we have to leave ruins behind. But not everything is a ruin. Not everything automatically is a ruin. You can say that a lunar landscape after a nuclear explosion is environment anyway, and technically it is. But it's not really, because it's congealed in a certain form. It's dead. The same with culture. Certain cultural forms, once they're transmitted, are simply waste products, not ruins. And we have to try, I believe, in this particular moment in time, and I'm thinking especially about cultural producers as specialized, so to say, cultural producers. We have to think about what we're leaving of this particular segment of time in terms of the potential for it to be a ruin. That is, the potential for what we leave of inspiring, helping, aiding, offering something on the basis of which post-future people will be able to start their own narration of the world. This is usually what happens in history. The archaic Greeks look at the Mycenaean heroes to write the Odyssey and the Iliad and start a new narration. The barbarian kingdoms in Western Europe in the early Middle Ages look at the world of Rome and its language and its institutions, which they usually misunderstand, but that doesn't matter, okay? Misunderstanding is part of this, obviously. The legacy of a lost civilization is misunderstood and retaken syncretically, and that's absolutely fine. But everybody always looks back, usually, to take elements and move forward. The exercise at this point, I believe, is first of all to consider that from this perspective, our present is not so much the trampoline towards the future, as we said. It's not what the contemporary as an expression tends to make us believe, as in, contemporary is a funny expression, I have to say. I've never liked it. It also makes very little sense. It seems to imply the idea that what we make in the contemporary age is contemporary, as in at the same time, contemporary, at the same time with itself, which is obvious, but really implies that this time never ends. It's contemporary with a certain moment in time that shall never pass, a present that will never end. And this is, of course, a pathetic case of denial. Okay, so but we have to consider that the present is not just contemporary, but is mostly the past. That we are the past of the post-future. Okay, and thus we are equally the past. Whatever we make today cannot count on coolness or hotness or whatever you want, or advertising any more than the relics of ancient Egypt or of the early Middle Ages or the Vedic societies in India. We are equally past, and we are together with 15th century BC and 15th century AD. From this perspective, then we have to understand of what we leave, what can we offer that is of the same cosmogonic, as in the creation, that has the same potential of aiding the creation of a new world, as the Iliad, or the Bhagavad Gita, or the Quran. Okay, so that is the kind of benchmark that we have to keep in mind, since we are the past of the post-future. This is a massive challenge, obviously. And I believe it, and to conclude, I believe this kind of offers a certain opportunity that not many people have. Being at the end of a certain historical era is a great opportunity, because we are sealing the legacy of this time. And this gives us a particular opportunity, which is that of betraying the legacy of this time. Leaving the legacy doesn't mean that we have to record what this society really was, what its ideas really were, what its way of worlding really was, and to convey it like in a time capsule. Who cares about that? We have no responsibility towards ourselves to be truthful. We can lie. We can invent a better past for ourselves and for the future. And probably we do want to create that. And once again, think about the idea of the statues. We don't have to musealize to turn into a museum the present world. Even removing statues makes sense. Even lying to a certain extent, refashioning what we have been makes sense, because we have no responsibility in terms of archival conservation of our own age. We can lie in the interest precisely of the people that will come after the end of this future. So we have this opportunity that doesn't often happen outside of the pages of Borges. It doesn't often happen in reality, okay? So we have this particular opportunity in time right now as cultural producers to reinvent what we have been, to live a different narration about the way in which we make world. And secondly, we have the opportunity of leaving a certain narration of the world, a certain suggestion on how to make world, a certain inspiration, and of course we have to do it with a specific language when we do this, a language that is understandable, that somehow speaks through the ages. And language ages very badly. If you look at, I don't know, Punch magazine from the 1850s, satirical English magazine, none of the jokes makes you laugh. The magazine is boring and mostly meaningless. So we have to be careful in the way in which we speak. But we have to be careful not only about the language, but we have to be careful about the type of suggestion. And we have the opportunity of leaving a suggestion that allows post-future archaics, adolescents, if you like, to make world in a way that tackles the problem of order and of disorder. How? And to close, I would like to leave this exact point. One of the problems that we are having at the moment in this particular civilization from which I'm speaking geographically and temporally, not that I necessarily subscribe to it, but this is where I find myself to live. One of the problems that we've had was the one-dimensionality of reality. Reality was built in a particular way, according to the rules of language, but of a specific type of language, descriptive and cataloging language. Everything in its right place in a series of ordered distinctions and definitions that can be recombined, a bit like 1 zeros in computation. Anything that doesn't fall within this very, very rigid structure, not only is not part of the narration, but it's not part of reality. You are erased. This leads, on the one hand, to the attempt to map everything, on the other, to the attempt of marginalized people to enter the discourse by creating new identities for oneself, which makes sense, of course, but unfortunately reinforces the system. And also to the situation in which countless people, by falling out of this very rigid idea about reality, for example, the reality coincides with linguistic definitions in a very particular way, people that fall out of this fall out of existence, undocumented migrants. You lose your passport, you are dead before you die. You go extinct before you die, to be more precise. What goes through a border control is never you, is your passport. That's what really goes through a border control. You're just a strange, awkward appendix of that piece of linguistic information. So we have the opportunity of not repeating the same mistake, of not leaving that legacy behind. We have the opportunity of imagining an idea of the world, for example, that is multidimensional. What does it mean? Multidimensional means that we can paint a picture of reality. We can suggest a method of making reality appear to us that sees in every single object a pen, not just what we can grab through different means of language, specific descriptive language, what I called absolute language in a recent book. For example, this pen is made of plastic, it's got a certain molecular composition, a certain economic history, productive history, a certain geographical history, so to say, and so on. But also that within this item, there are dimensions within this, within me, there is much more than any specific form of reality can capture. There are elements in this that are, for example, mythological. They have to do with imaginary levels of existence. There are elements within this object that are ineffable, that go beyond any possibility of cataloging through language or grasping through language in any way. For example, the mere fact that this pen exists. I can describe everything about this pen, but I cannot describe the fact that it exists. There are elements beyond even the ineffable, that there is the element of pure being as being the locality in which being there is there. It's very difficult to express these things very briefly in a few minutes. There are elements of non-being within this. There are elements of non-relationality. There are dimensions within this object that go beyond any form of imagination, whether linguistic or non-linguistic, any form of perception, because they go beyond the field of what can be grasped through relations, for example, and so on and so forth. You see, the ability to see in every single object a multiplicity of dimensions, this and me, translates into the ability to see in the environment around ourselves, in every single speck, a multiplicity of dimensions. And this means that whatever rule applies to one of these dimensions only, for example, to the dimension in which I am Italian, male, tall a certain amount of centimeters, blah, 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 and so on and so forth, that defines only a very small fraction of this object, which is me. It doesn't say much about me. It says about me only a little bit. And that little bit, since it is small and confined, since it doesn't coincide with the totality of existence, is not surrounded by nothing. If I fall out of this, if I cease being, for example, easily identifiable gender-wise, I don't fall out into nothingness. But simply, it means that that part of me is cannot be localized within that, but it can be localized in another dimension that constitutes me. You see, every dimension, since it becomes confined, becomes a game. The definition of playing, among the many aspects of the definition of playing, but the definition of a game has to do specifically with the limits of that particular world. A world that is unlimited is no longer a game, it's very serious, it's a win-all, lose-all. A game is confined and limited. A multi-dimensional understanding of reality might allow post-future adolescents to take up the challenge of making a new world without the anguish of being constricted within their own creation as within a prison that never ends, but rather of engaging with different forms of worlding simultaneously in the same world, as if engaging with different games. I will leave it here, because of course this is something that we could discuss for much longer, but just to recapitulate, what I would suggest to consider at the moment as cultural producers, and especially in general, but especially as cultural producers who happen to live within the metronome, in the rhythm of a certain civilization that is coming to an end, possibly, thank God, but, without any particular judgment on that, is coming to an end, neutrally, to consider the challenge of speaking beyond the end of this time segment, adapting the language, but especially taking up the challenge of leaving fertile ruins behind us that will allow post-future adolescents, archaics, to make world differently, and also to accept the possibility of just lying to do so, reinventing, not being faithful to what there is. To do so, once again, it is important to look at ourselves as if we were looking at a past object, not as a present object. Not with the eye of the contemporary, but with the familiarity with the Mycenaeans, with the ancient Egyptians, with the Aztec, with the Incas, we all share the same status of being the past of the post-future, and also with the same quality standards.
Thank you, Federico. We appreciate this idea of fertile ruins. As you know, Riga, Latvia, and the Baltics are a central inspiration for this program, as places where, having undergone occupations, wars, economic flux, worlds have ended many times. This region has rebooted, has built anew, has lived, aged, died. And as you mentioned before, apocalypses are not uncommon. One of the intents of our glossary is understanding how words make worlds, and how this activity of world making can go beyond the linguistic structures that order the world. This is an immense problem, of course, for all beings who are unassignable to particular categories of language, such as gender, citizenship, or even the more than post non-human. Perhaps for those who Technic and Magic is dedicated to, I recall fondly this line in the book: those who lie defeated by history and the present in the most general and more tragic sense. And to start with a simple question, I wonder if you could tell us about the roles of practice, political work, and activism in narrating another legacy of the post-future.
An important role, but not, I am saying my particular opinion about this. So this is obviously no dogma or But I think it has an important role, but not an all-encompassing role. Political action today is important because while we are the past of the post-future, we are also our own present. And in our own present, it is important to struggle immediately. The people that lie defeated by history, to a certain extent, need, on the one hand, the consolation to be able to live through their defeat, through our defeat, but also they might want, and rightly so, to engage and try to subvert the balance of forces immediately to make a better present for themselves now, and possibly a better present for the little bit of future that is left. So it is important, necessarily, absolutely yes, and it is, I think, mostly ethical imperative to engage in political activism and political work. That said, there is also to consider the fact that political work doesn't necessarily translate into any stable transformation of reality. Within certain time segments, there are political revolutions, as in transformations, but also revolutions, as in going around in an orbit all the way to the beginning. And they are always kind of in transformation, in becoming, and fragile. So we cannot put all our hopes in this kind of end of time, kind of complete transformation of the universe through political work. My belief is that we have to complement that necessarily with metaphysical work. Just to clarify, because I've used this word a couple of times and I have not described it. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy, obviously, and it comes from the order in which the books of Aristotle were placed by one of his editors of the time. He wrote a book on the physics, and then the book after that was called the book Ta Metaphysica, so the stuff that comes after the physics. So basically it's like I don't know, Terminator 2, okay, so that's basically what it means literally. But metaphysics, more specifically, has to do with the fundamental structures of reality. Okay, so while political activity is important, it requires metaphysics both before and after, in the sense that to achieve certain political aims effectively, it is necessary to transform the understanding of reality. For example, I remember one thing that struck me a while ago when we were talking about migrations in Europe. And I remember this left-wing politician, I don't remember their name, I don't know who this person was, saying that we have to not sink migrant boats and not kill them all because they were good for the economy. And this betrayed a certain understanding of reality in which the reality was made of these economic factors fundamentally. And then people, but people were more like a superstition, you know, like you talk about energy or souls, you know, this kind of like a little bit of a superstitious thing. The real thing was economy. Now, if you enter this language, whatever political struggle you make, you will never achieve anything but reinforcing the system. The point is not just to radicalize the language in a nonsensical, randomic, kind of like aggressive way, but metaphysically to challenge the very items that constitute the discourse. So, changing the metaphysics allows for better politics, but also considering the fact that, you know, political action tends to have a certain effect, a certain echo within the time segment in which it takes place. Also, metaphysics allows for the establishment of a bridge beyond that particular age. So, yes, definitely political activism, especially, it is a moral imperative, I believe, for the present, but it has to be complemented, I believe, by metaphysical work, which, in the way in which I describe it, obviously sounds more like poetic work, and that's okay.
Federico, and wedding the political and metaphysical work with COVID-19 and the worldwide demonstrations for support of Black Lives Matter, it looks indeed like we're nearing the end of something. Yet I'm currently in Berlin, and frankly, it seems that normality and order have reinstated themselves quite quickly. A similar thing happened, I believe, with the global upheavals of 1968, more recently with WikiLeaks, which in time led to renewed forms of surveillance and control. we know what is happening, and it seems that we don't want to change our behavior. Could you comment on this?
Well, I mean, here I would like to, and once again, these are just my opinions, so you can take them and bin them immediately. But my perception of what the situation we find ourselves in this particular moment in time, this is not a moral judgment in any way. It's just like I am trying to the best of my abilities to try and observe what's going on. I have noticed a certain, yes, of course, there is always this attempt to go back to normality. And people having, I don't know, coffee, and coffee probably not, but, you know, like having breakfast among the ruins of Berlin in 1945. I remember those pictures. Or in the Blitz in London. There is always an attempt to simulate normality. And that's absolutely fine. I mean, it is understandable. It usually happens. In this particular moment, it strikes me one thing is, I've noticed that what something is really changing and has been changing for a while. It seems that the way in which we are engaging with society at the moment, for good or bad reasons, it is moving from the idea of engaging with reality, with society through a discourse, so through a certain kind of like a debate that is based on shared and agreed upon fundamental principles that allow for a certain discussion to take place kind of in a civilized and orderly fashion, to a challenge to that particular system. I have to say this has emerged most strongly first with the alt-right rather than with Black Lives Matter. They were the first that really kind of like inserted this very strong conflictual element. For example, that the discourse doesn't make sense anymore. Truth doesn't make sense. You see, this kind of particular challenge shifts the balance from the discourse to the conflict, which is just a different, they're both equally fine, okay, but it's just a different way of engaging. And of course, within the realm of conflict, the items of discourse don't quite apply in the same way. Certain attempts don't work. And now it seems that the opposite side of the spectrum, the left, is kind of engaging with that attempt to shift towards conflict with another attempt of making more conflict. It possibly is a good idea. I don't want to comment on that in particular. I just want to try and observe if I can. My impression is that from this particular situation in which the conflictual potential of the present is intensified on both sides and on all sides really, and so in which a certain discourse is no longer possible. First, it's good because a large part of the discourse was bullshit anyway, to be frank. Secondly, it is the only way in which you disrupt a certain discourse is through conflict. So definitely. But third, we also have to keep in mind, and once again, it's not a tragedy, but it is an element of concern, that usually when you shift from the order of a discourse to an element of conflict, the next step typically is war. And it seems to me at the moment that the immediate horizon that we are facing is not so much the return to a pre-conflict normality, but the intensification of conflict to an element of war, which could take many forms. Civil war, most likely. In the US, for example, there is this kind of flirt with civil war in every possible declination of the expression, from going around armed to this particular confrontation intensifies, or international war. So my international war, of course, since the dissolution of the post-war kind of global order as in the Cold War, and the post-Cold War global order as in the American order, at the moment we're finding ourselves in a situation not dissimilar from 1914. You know, many global powers, each of them with their own thing, competing for resources, and so on and so forth. My impression is that that particular scenario is the most likely to emerge in what is left of this future, and probably will be what seals the end of this particular future. So the attempt to go back to normality are quite sweet, but I doubt they will translate into a kind of an actual return to the normality of the discourse as we knew it.
Right, so I'd like for us to pause here before the end of this time segment. From and focus on this idea of that from the space of total conflict, where we clearly seem to be walking towards, to the aesthetic and poetic possibilities of narrating a different legacy. How do we foster new aesthetic gestures after the end of the future?
New aesthetic acts. This is a typical problem of parenthood. Being a parent, as I am, for example, I mean, you engage with another person whose only difference towards you is not that they are at an earlier stage of development or more primitive or anything, but they live in another world. And it is complicated, of course, because speaking across metaphysical distinctions is difficult. You don't speak the same language, time doesn't flow the same way, the world is not made of the same things. So it is a very complicated problem. One thing that I would suggest is to try and adopt their particular perspective, not in the sense of trying to imagine what the world looks like to them, because you cannot really do that much. You can pretend, and sometimes it's a bit pathetic if you try to do that. But more like in the sense of looking at yourself as if you were somebody else, as if you were their past. Thinking about children, for example. Okay, you realize that what you're creating at that particular moment, where you constitute their past. Being a parent, for example, implies that what you are creating with a 5-year-old, you are creating their childhood memories. This room around us has the same filter that memories in my mind have from when I am 5 years old. It looks like absolutely present to me, but I realize that in the eyes of my son, for example, this is the past. And this way of estrangement from oneself, in the fashion of looking at oneself as the past, is a small trick, but I think it allows for a certain relaxation, for example, of the concerns that you have about the absolute domination of the present in your hands and the projection towards the future, and also for a certain scenographic care, as in scenography. You kind of like, what you are curating to a certain extent is the atmosphere. Is a certain atmosphere in which certain things become possible. So if I imagine about the aesthetic acts that somehow speak to the people of the post-future, I imagine it not dissimilarly with the way in which, for example, an adult and a child, once again, not as hierarchically placed, but as simply people that happen to live in the same room in different worlds, kind of interact. And on the side of the adult, being the past, I suggest the main aesthetic act is the creation of a general atmosphere, of a scenography in which certain possibilities become reasonable. So of dealing with the world as a theater to a certain extent, but with the substance of this theater being the substance of memory, and yourself as the substance of a memory. And this, once again, allows for a certain relaxation, for a certain particular care, and a certain touch, and importance also of style. So a lot of things that sound very kind of like useless frills, actually reacquire a different importance. Aside from that, there are the obvious things. I mean, talking about empathy, talking about and so on and so forth, but also realizing I don't believe so much in so-called absolutely selfless motivations. They can always be reconducted to selfish motivations, and also they always strike me as a bit implausible. But realizing also in a selfish way, so to say, that since the way in which we make world is aesthetic, okay, it's through aesthetics that we are able of making this beautiful landscape around ourselves that doesn't exist. This landscape around me doesn't exist. It exists because I create it, and I create according to rules. To make it happen, I need to use a certain machine, so to say, the aesthetic machine. And this machine, basically, like any machine, has its own demands. Like anybody that uses a tool knows that a tool has its own demands. If you want to use the tool, you have to respect the demands, otherwise the tool doesn't work. So if you want to make world, we need to respect the demand of this aesthetic machine. And basically the demand is only one, like any machine, that you allow for the machine to keep working after you have finished with it. So allowing and helping post-future people to make worlds, so being part of aiding the aesthetic machine to continue functioning after you've finished is not just being very nice, but it is respecting the only demand that the machine has, basically. Leaving a legacy allows that the machine works today. If we don't respect this demand of the machine, today the machine jams. It jams today for us immediately. We stop making world around ourselves. Epidemics of psychopathologies have many multiple reasons having to do with social structures, of course, but also have to do with a certain jamming, so to say, of the aesthetic machine, the certain inability to respect the only demand that it has, not to leave behind us, as Tacitus says, a desert and call it peace, but to allow for this continuous transformation, for what we do to become ruins, not just products, not just waste products, but ruins, and so on and so forth. So this is what I see as a sort of like suggestion and ethical responsibility in dealing with post-future subjects.
I was quite taken by this idea of those who have inhabited the world stage before us are actually those who are contemporary with us. And our contemporaneity is actually the past of the post-future. So going back to this idea and considering that you've read all across Mediterranean to Eastern philosophies and mystical thinking from various traditions, have these added to your views on time? And what do they bring to the metaphysical imaginary?
Many things and more that I can sum up in 5 minutes. One thing that struck me very much in, for example, studying for a long time mystical writing from different parts of the world. In the book that you mentioned kindly, I talk in particular about Islamic mysticism and aspects of a certain school of Hindu theology, philosophy, Advaita Vedanta, non-dualist Vedanta. So between especially Shia, mystical Islam in the Shia denominations, and Vedanta in Technic and Magic, I discuss a number of things. In the present book that I'm publishing in a few months, Prophetic Culture, I have inserted into the equation Christian mysticism, which was something I've been fascinated with for a long time, and I've also added that into the equation, plus, of course, many other things. Late ancient pagan mysticism, for example. One thing that struck me is the similarity of all these approaches. As if there was what perennialist thinkers, perennialism is a particular theological, philosophical movement, so to say, of the early 20th century, people like René Guénon, Ananda Coomaraswamy, and they suggested that there was what they call the underlying religion, as in a certain particular attitude to reality that, aside from specific religious denominations, whether it's called Sufism or it's called mystical orthodoxy in Christianity or so on and so forth, tends to have the same kind of understanding. And this is the first thing that struck me. So that the distinction between religions in terms of denominations is probably much less accurate than the distinction within religions between an esoteric, so to say, aspect, which is mystical in some parts, mythological in other parts, quite complex and having to do with hermeneutics, and the literal part of the religion. So the part of the religion that has to do with the establishment of the law. Okay? So within religions, these two aspects are usually very similar. In any religion, you can put together all the literalists in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and so on and so forth together. They would probably find each other very pleasant to their own company, and all the esotericists together. So this is a distinction that I've realized, for example, when looking. And the other thing that struck me as similar in all these different traditions is this particular strange movement. So in esoteric elements of religions, esotericism, once again, doesn't mean you do strange things with black cats. It's a technical word, of course. You have esotericism and esotericism, or exoterism and esotericism. Exoterism is the part of religion or of a certain discourse. Plato, for example, did exoteric and esoteric writings. Exoteric means public. Esoteric means private. Okay. This doesn't, of course, explain exactly what esotericism is, but gives you just an idea that it's something that doesn't have as its ambition the establishment of a new public order. That is a discourse, as Derrida would say, among friends. Okay? So in that particular esoteric, so to say, attempt, I've always noticed this movement between coming from the world, so coming from a certain idea of reality and accepting as it is, destroying the world, so challenging everything with a critical discourse to the utmost degree, okay? Not even punks are as radical as a lot of mystical movements, for example. The Malamatiya in Islam, for example, are typical, or the Franciscans in Christianity, and many, many others. So complete disintegration of those rules. And then a return. After the disintegration, a return back to the world with a completely different attitude, in which the subject is in the world but outside of the world, or more precisely, is a foreigner to the world, or the world is a foreign land, as Hugh of St. Victor said. This is something that struck me very much, and this has influenced, for example, what I think. When I was suggesting to look at our own present as the past, is once again this kind of exercise of estrangement. But you see, it's not an estrangement of the things around ourselves while we remain stable, but an estrangement of the entire world in itself, including what there is of worldly within us. So those parts of ourselves that can be catalogued and defined neatly in a certain way that is the way of the world, the way of language. So this second aspect of this movement of annihilation and reconstitution, to use a Sufi terminology, fana and baka, has struck me as a very important exercise, not only as a spiritual exercise, of course, and to be honest, philosophy in general is, as Pierre Hadot contends, is a spiritual exercise. Otherwise is a bit useless. But also as an intellectual tool to kind of like face certain problems, first by looking at them as if you were a native of that problem. The word native is one of those terms that I always found very strange in general, even when it's used with the best of intentions. It always strikes me as slightly nonsensical. But of looking at them as a foreigner, okay, kind of like doing this movement of back and forth. So yeah, of course there is much more than that, but just to single out two elements: a renewed look at religions and ideologies, so to say. The same, of course, applies to ideologies as it applies to religions, and this particular movement in and out of the world.
Federico, looking to estrangement as a form of positioning oneself outside of time, and the concrete discussion around toppling monuments that celebrate capital and slavery in public space, the discussion around transitional justice, reparations for slavery, for war. Are these a rupture with reality? Are these a continuum, or are they something else entirely?
If you discuss the element of reparations, the intention is excellent, obviously. You want to realize that certain actions cannot be, are not okay and cannot be deemed as okay ever. They have to be fixed somehow or dismantled. But there is always a problem. If you consider the readjustment as a reparation, basically, first of all, you declare the historical continuity with that situation as something that you want to keep. That event and the present are continuous, and we want to be continuous somehow, and we want to somehow reclaim that past, keep it attached, and by reparations we redeem retrospectively that past and we continue that particular story. Okay, it might have some tactical advantages, and I don't deny that. But it has some problems, because I think it limits the ambition of creating a discontinuity. And in terms of a discontinuity, then you can discuss the very same thing, no longer in terms of reparations, but in sense of a new order, as in the sense of a new cosmos, of a new setting, of a new world. So I am ambivalent about the word reparation. I'm not ambivalent about the concept, about what the word is meant to signify. But once again, every word is a metaphor. And every metaphor is a bit dangerous because it includes and entails much more that is contained. that particular word leaves me a bit unsure, in the same way that, for example, the word resistance always left me very suspicious. Resistance basically means that you are in a situation in which the only two options are either you lose or everything remains the same. Resistance. Resistance even to a physical body. If you push it, either the body gives way or it remains still where it is. As a concept for struggle, I don't find it particularly interesting. It has some problems, considering that every word is a metaphor, obviously. And in the same way, reparations, not sure. I think we might be better off in trying to invent a better metaphor to mean exactly, to signify what exactly we mean by that.
Federico, and now for a rhythmical note looming on the end of our narration. How does magic help us access the multidimensional, the estrangement, and the ineffable?
Okay. The reason I imagine why you're asking me to comment on magic is because in the book that I wrote, in the title, the second word is magic. But I need to clarify a little bit my use of that term. As I try to explain in the book itself, magic, of course, like any term, was used to signify a million different things. I look at it in particular etymologically in the way in which it being a Greek word, it is actually a foreignism, so to say, because it is the adoption of a Persian term having to do with the Magi. The Magi were the priests, basically, of Zoroastrian Persia. And magic was the particular art of this particular strange caste of priests. But you see, as seen from the Greeks. So what does it say about magic? Magic is us looking at them, and when we look at them, and the thing that it makes them as different from us, okay? So we are the Greeks, they are the Persians, we hate them, we are completely different from them, okay? But the thing that embodies their foreignness to us, their alienness to us, is the heart of their belief structure, and also of their ability to bring about miracles and powerful forces in the world, i.e. the work of the Magi. So magic, in a way, signifies what for us is them, and especially the central power of them that makes them entirely foreign to us. So it is the definition of foreignness in that sense. Magic, in the way that I have used it, and there can be, of course, a million different ways of engaging with the word and with the concept, but I have decided, I've chosen to engage specifically with this understanding of magic as the dealing with alienness and foreignness, first, within the world, in the sense, when I was talking about the ineffable, that element that is irreducible within things and within ourselves, and also towards the world, in the sense that every particular world then becomes confined and becomes, as I was saying earlier, a game, no longer a very serious thing. So this was the particular understanding, and in a way, like what I was trying to suggest earlier when talking about historical movements and ways of looking at cultural work, contains exactly the same magical element. But it doesn't have to do, just to clarify, it doesn't have to do with the evocation of spirits or with making people fall in love with you with some strange filters or something like that. Not in the way in which I understand it, okay? Not in the way in which I have used the term. Of course, it can be understood in different ways, but this is the particular way in which I suggest to look at it.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you for your talk, for engaging with us with another view of time, in other ways of imagining what the end of a world might look like and might mean as we begin to sync different narratives and different political timeframes. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for your patience and for listening.